The howl that tore through the Ashwood territory that night was not one of celebration. It was the sound of a woman's whole world cracking open in front of 300 wolves who had once called her their Luna. Elena Voss stood at the edge of the gathering stone, her hands cold, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the wolves nearest to her could hear it. 21 years. 21 years of loyalty, of raising pups, of standing beside Marcus Cole through wars, through winters, through every storm that had tried to break their pack apart. And now, under the same moon that had witnessed her wedding vows, she watched him stand at the center of the circle, with his hand wrapped around the fingers of a woman barely older than their own daughter. Brielle Hart, 24 years old. New to the pack, chosen. Elena had not been told beforehand. She had learned only an hour earlier, when Marcus asked her to join the evening gathering for an important announcement, his voice flat, his eyes refusing to meet hers. She had walked to the stone circle expecting perhaps news of a new alliance, or a border dispute resolved. She had not expected to watch her mate raise another woman's hand into the air and declare, in front of everyone, that Brielle would become his second mate. By the old right of strengthening bloodlines, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the practiced authority of an alpha who had never once, in 21 years, needed to explain himself to anyone. I take Brielle Hart as my second mate, for the future strength of Ashwood. Silence. Then a murmur, low and uncertain, rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Elena felt every eye shift toward her, felt the weight of 300 stares settle onto her shoulders like stones. She kept her spine straight. She had learned, over 2 decades of being a leader's wife, how to keep her face still even when everything inside her was falling apart. Her daughter Sophie stood near the front of the crowd, her mouth open, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her son, Daniel, was rigid beside his sister, his jaw clenched so tightly that Elena worried he might shatter his own teeth. Neither of them had known. Of course they hadn't. Marcus had planned this the way he planned everything, quietly, efficiently, without a single crack in the wall until the moment he wanted the world to see it. Elena's oldest friend in the pack, a quiet, steady woman named Margaret, pressed close to her side. Breathe, Margaret whispered. Just breathe, Elena. Whatever happens next, breathe. Elena did not trust herself to speak. She only nodded. Marcus finally turned to look at her, and for one fragile second, something like guilt flickered across his face. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the mask of authority he wore like armor. Elena remains Luna, he added, as if that single sentence could soften 21 years of betrayal into something manageable. Nothing changes for her standing in this pack. But everything had already changed. Elena could feel it in the air, in the way the wolves around her shifted their attention toward Brielle, toward the young woman with dark hair and sharp green eyes who stood glowing under Marcus's hand as though she had won some grand prize. Perhaps in her mind she had. Elena turned and walked away from the stone circle before the gathering ended, before the wolves could see whatever expression might slip past her careful composure. She did not run. She never ran. She walked with the same steady grace she had carried for 21 years, even though every step felt like walking across broken glass. Margaret caught up to her at the tree line. Elena, wait. I'm fine, Elena said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. You don't have to be fine. Not tonight. Elena stopped walking and pressed a hand to the trunk of an old oak tree, the bark rough and familiar beneath her palm. She had leaned against this same tree the night Marcus proposed to her, 23 years ago, when she was young and hopeful and certain that love was enough to build a life on. She had leaned against it again the night Daniel was born, exhausted and radiant, Marcus's hand in hers. Now she leaned against it because her legs would not hold her steady any other way. How long? She asked quietly. How long has this been happening, Margaret? Tell me the truth. Margaret hesitated, and that hesitation told Elena everything she needed to know. A few months, Margaret admitted. I only started noticing recently. I hoped it was nothing. I didn't want to be the one to tell you something so painful without being certain. Elena closed her eyes. A few months, perhaps longer. While she had been tending to the pack's sick, mediating disputes between neighboring families, staying up late reviewing treaties Marcus was too tired to read himself, he had been slipping away to spend time with a woman young enough to be their daughter. Does Sophie know? Elena asked. Did she know before tonight? No one knew, Elena. Marcus kept it hidden well. He always does. That much was true. Marcus Cole had built his reputation on control. Control over the pack's borders, over its politics, over every variable that might threaten Ashwood's stability. Elena had once found that quality reassuring. Now it felt like a blade she had never seen coming until it was already buried in her chest. She thought of the early years of their marriage, when Marcus used to tell her she was the only stability he needed, the only anchor strong enough to hold a growing pack together. She thought of the nights he had come home from difficult negotiations and rested his head in her lap, exhausted, murmuring that he did not know how he would lead without her steady hand beside him. Had all of that been true once and simply faded, or had some of it always been convenient words, spoken because they were useful at the time? She did not know, and not knowing hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. By the time she reached the modest cabin she still, for now, called home, her hands had stopped shaking, replaced instead by a strange, hollow calm. She sat at the small wooden table where she and Marcus used to share breakfast before the demands of pack leadership pulled them in different directions, and she stared at the grain of the wood as though it might offer her some answer the rest of the world could not. Daniel arrived first, storming through the door without knocking, his young face twisted with anger. "I'm going to talk to him," he said. "This isn't right. 21 years, and he just stands up there and—" "Daniel." Elena's voice was steady, though her heart was anything but. "Sit down. How can you be calm right now? Because falling apart will not undo what happened tonight," she said, "and because your father is still your alpha, whether either of us likes his choices or not." Daniel sat, reluctantly, his hands curling into fists on the table. Sophie arrived moments later, her eyes red-rimmed, and folded herself into the chair beside her brother without a word. "I don't understand," Sophie finally whispered. "You gave him everything. You gave up your own family's pack to come here. You built this place beside him. How could he do this?" Elena did not have an answer that would satisfy her daughter's pain, so she offered the only truth she had. "I don't know, Sophie. I wish I did." The three of them sat together in silence as the fire in the hearth burned low, none of them willing to be the first to speak the fear that hung heavy in the room, that this was only the beginning, that whatever came next would reshape all of their lives in ways none of them could yet predict. Outside, the gathering continued without her, the pack's murmurs of celebration for Brielle drifting faintly on the night wind. Elena listened to the distant sound and felt something inside her, some old ember of pride long buried beneath years of quiet devotion, begin to stir. She thought of her father, a man she rarely spoke of even to her own children, a man whose name she had folded away along with her old life the day she chose to become Marcus Cole's mate. She thought of the trunk in the back of her closet, untouched for over 2 decades, containing letters and records she had sealed away when she left her birth pack behind. For 21 years, she had been only Elena, the Luna of Ashwood, the quiet woman who kept the peace and asked for nothing in return. Tonight, something had shifted in her, some old part of herself stirring awake after a long, deliberate sleep. She did not yet know what she would do. But she knew, with sudden and unshakable certainty, that she would not spend the rest of her life quietly accepting whatever scraps of dignity Marcus decided to leave her. The fire crackled. Sophie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Daniel stared at the door, jaw still tight, waiting for a fight that had not yet come but was, Elena suspected, already on its way. Somewhere beyond the trees, the gathering finally began to quiet, wolves dispersing into the night, whispering about the young woman who had just become their alpha's second mate, and about the long-serving Luna who had walked away without a single word of protest. They did not know, not yet, what silence like that could mean. Elena rose from the table as the last embers glowed in the hearth, kissed her children's foreheads, and told them both to rest. Then she walked to her bedroom, opened the closet door, and stared for a long moment at the old, dust-covered trunk pushed into the farthest corner. She did not open it that night, but she did not look away from it either. For the first time in 21 years, Elena Voss found herself remembering that before she had ever been anyone's Luna, she had been something else entirely, something the pack around her had long since forgotten, and something she herself had almost let slip away. 3 days after the gathering, Elena stood in the training yard watching her son Daniel spar with one of the younger warriors, and that was when she saw them together for the first time since the announcement. Marcus and Brielle, walking close along the northern fence line, their heads bent toward one another, laughing at something only they could hear. Elena's stomach tightened, but she did not look away. She had promised herself, lying awake the night before, that she would not hide from this. Hiding would only give the pack more reason to whisper, more reason to pity her, and pity was the one thing Elena Voss refused to accept. Brielle noticed her first. The younger woman's laughter faded, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable, guilt perhaps, or simple discomfort, before she composed herself and offered Elena a small, polite nod. Marcus, to his credit, did not look away either. He met Elena's gaze across the training yard, and for a moment neither of them moved. Luna Voss, Brielle said carefully, closing the distance between them with a confidence that seemed too practiced for someone so young. I hope there are no hard feelings. I only wish to serve this pack well. Elena studied her for a long moment. Up close, Brielle was even younger than she had appeared at the gathering, her features soft, her eyes bright with the kind of ambition Elena remembered feeling once, decades ago, before life had worn her down into someone more careful. There is no need to explain yourself to me, Elena said, her voice even. You did not choose this alone. Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise perhaps, that Elena had not raised her voice, had not made a scene the way he might have expected. She almost smiled at the realization that after 21 years, her own mate still did not fully understand her. Elena, Marcus said, stepping forward. I know this has been difficult. Difficult, Elena repeated softly. Is that the word you have chosen for it? He had the decency to look uncomfortable at least. The council believes this alliance will strengthen the pack. Brielle's family controls the eastern hunting grounds. Her bloodline is strong. It was never meant to diminish you. And yet here I am, Elena said, diminished. She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back toward the training yard, where Daniel had stopped sparring entirely, watching the exchange with barely contained fury. Elena caught his eye and gave a small shake of her head, a silent plea for him to hold his temper, at least for now. That evening, Margaret came to visit, carrying a basket of bread and a look of quiet concern. The pack is talking, she said, setting the basket on the table. Some believe Marcus made a wise political move. Others believe he has disgraced you in front of everyone who once respected you. And what do you believe? Elena asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. I believe you have spent 21 years making yourself smaller so that Marcus could stand taller. I believe it is long past time you remembered how to take up space of your own. The words settled into Elena's chest like a seed finding fertile soil. She thought of them again later that night, alone in her room, staring once more at the dust-covered trunk in the corner of her closet. This time, she knelt before it, brushed away the dust with trembling fingers, and unlatched the old iron clasp. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth that had yellowed with age, she found the remnants of a life she had buried the day she chose Marcus. A woven pendant bearing the symbol of a bloodline older than Ashwood itself. A stack of letters, their ink faded but still legible. And beneath it all, a small leather journal that had once belonged to her father. She had not opened that journal in over 2 decades. Her hands shook as she lifted it now, the leather worn soft with age, the pages inside filled with her father's careful handwriting. She remembered him only in fragments, a deep voice, a steady presence, a way of looking at problems that made even the most impossible situations feel solvable. She had been young when she left her birth pack, young and in love, eager to build a new life, far from the shadow of a father whose legacy she had never quite felt equal to. She opened the journal to a random page and began to read, her father's words rising up from the past like a voice she had almost forgotten. The debt owed to us by the northern packs will outlast my lifetime, he had written. Let it be known that the peace I have built was not given freely. It was earned through sacrifice, and it must be honored by those who inherit its protection, whether they remember the cost or not. Elena frowned, reading the passage again. She had known, vaguely, that her father had brokered peace between rival territories decades ago, before she was even born. But she had never fully understood the scope of what he had done, nor the debts that peace might have created. She turned another page, and then another, piecing together fragments of a history she had spent 21 years trying to forget. Her father, Aldrich Voss, had not simply been a respected alpha. He had been the architect of an entire era of peace, a leader whose decisions had shaped the fate of territories far beyond his own, including, she realized with a slow, dawning understanding, the very pack she had married into. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, her mind racing. If what she was piecing together was true, then her marriage to Marcus may not have been born purely from love, as she had believed for over 2 decades. It may have been born from obligation, a debt her father's legacy had placed upon the Ashwood bloodline long before she and Marcus ever met. The thought should have devastated her. Instead, it steadied her, like a missing piece finally sliding into place. The next morning, she sought out Henry, one of the oldest elders in the pack, a wolf who had served under Marcus's father before Marcus himself ever became alpha. She found him near the eastern well, drawing water with the slow, careful movements of a man who had lived long enough to no longer rush through his days. "Elena," Henry said, surprised. "It is good to see you. I heard about the gathering. I am sorry." "Henry," Elena said, choosing her words carefully. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He studied her for a moment, then set down his bucket. "Ask. What do you know about my father, about Aldrich Voss, and the treaty he made with this pack, long before I was born?" Henry's expression shifted, some old caution flickering behind his eyes. "That is a very old story, Elena. Why do you ask now?" "Because I think it matters more than anyone in this pack has admitted to me," she said. "Please, Henry, tell me the truth." The old wolf was quiet for a long moment, glancing around as though to be certain no one else was near enough to hear. Finally he sighed, the weight of decades settling into his shoulders. "Your father saved this pack," Henry said quietly. "Long before you were born, the Northern Territories nearly wiped Ashwood from existence. Marcus's father was young then, untested, and the pack was weak. Aldrich Voss brokered a peace that should have been impossible. He asked for very little in return. At the time, only a promise." "What promise?" Henry hesitated, then met her eyes. "That someday, when the debt came due, Ashwood would honor whatever request the Voss bloodline made of them." Elena felt the floor shift beneath her feet, though she had not moved at all. "And my marriage to Marcus," she said slowly. "Was that the debt being repaid?" Henry did not answer right away, and his silence was answer enough. "I do not know all the details," he admitted finally. "That knowledge belonged to Marcus's father, and much of it may have died with him. But I do know this, Elena. Whatever brought you and Marcus together all those years ago, it was never a simple thing. And it may not be something Marcus himself even fully understood, especially if his father chose not to share every detail before passing leadership to him." Elena thanked Henry and walked away from the well in a daze, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. She had spent 21 years believing her marriage was a choice born purely of love. Now she wondered how much of it had been shaped by forces far older and larger than herself, forces that had been moving long before she was ever old enough to understand them. That night, she sat with her father's journal open on her lap, reading late into the night by candlelight, searching for any further clues about the treaty, about the debt, about the true weight of the legacy she had spent so long trying to leave behind. She did not yet know how she would use what she was learning. But for the first time since the gathering, Elena felt something other than grief settling into her chest. She felt the quiet, steady stirrings of purpose, the sense that the story of her life was far from finished, and that the next chapter might be one she alone would choose to write. Outside her window, the moon rose high over Ashwood territory, illuminating a pack that had no idea how much its history was about to resurface, or how deeply that history was tied to the quiet woman they had all, for 21 years, underestimated. The council chamber was unusually full the following week, word having spread that Marcus intended to formally present Brielle before the pack's senior members, seeking their blessing for the arrangement in a more official capacity than the public gathering had provided. Elena had not been asked to attend. She came anyway. She stood near the back of the chamber, her presence rippling through the room like a stone dropped into still water. Conversations paused, heads turned. Marcus, seated at the head of the long stone table, froze mid-sentence when he noticed her standing there, arms folded, expression calm and unreadable. "Elena," he said carefully, "I did not expect you." "Clearly," she replied. "Please continue. I would like to hear how you plan to explain this arrangement to the council." Brielle sat beside him, her spine straight, her expression carefully composed, though Elena noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Whatever confidence the young woman had displayed in the training yard seemed to falter slightly under Elena's steady gaze. Margaret, seated among the senior members, caught Elena's eye and gave the smallest nod of encouragement. Henry sat further down the table, his expression thoughtful, watchful. Marcus cleared his throat and resumed his presentation, outlining the political benefits of the alliance with Brielle's family, the strengthened control over the eastern hunting grounds, the promise of new bloodlines that would fortify Ashwood's future generations. It was, Elena had to admit, a well-constructed argument. Marcus had always been skilled at making his personal decisions sound like strategic necessities. When he finished, an elder named Oliver, a wolf known for his blunt manner and little patience for diplomatic softness, spoke up. "And what of Elena? 21 years she has served as Luna. What does the council say about setting her aside in favor of a woman she has barely known a season?" "Elena remains Luna," Marcus said quickly. "Nothing about her position changes." Nothing changes, Oliver repeated skeptically, except that she now shares a title she once held alone, and shares it with someone barely old enough to remember the winters Elena helped this pack survive. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Elena felt a flicker of gratitude toward Oliver, though she kept her expression neutral, unwilling to let the room see how much his words had steadied her. "If I may," Elena said, stepping forward for the first time. The chamber fell silent, every eye turning toward her. "I did not come here to argue against the council's decisions. I came only to ask a question, one I believe deserves an honest answer." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Elena, this is not the time." "On the contrary," she said calmly, "I believe this is precisely the time." She turned to address the council directly. "How many of you remember the treaty between Ashwood and the Northern Territories, brokered decades ago by my father, Aldrich Voss?" The room went utterly still. Henry's expression shifted into something careful and alert. Margaret sat up straighter. Even Brielle looked confused, glancing between Elena and Marcus as though searching for context she did not possess. Marcus's face had gone pale. "Elena, this is not the place." "Is it not?" Elena interrupted, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I have recently learned that my marriage to you may not have been born purely from affection, as I believed for 21 years, but from a debt your father's bloodline owed to mine. A debt that saved this very pack from destruction. Is that not relevant to a discussion about honoring commitments, and about what this pack owes to those who have sacrificed for it?" A wave of murmurs swept through the chamber, elders exchanging glances, some nodding slowly as fragments of old memory resurfaced, others looking utterly bewildered by information they had never possessed. "That treaty is ancient history," Marcus said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It has no bearing on decisions made today." "Does it not?" Elena asked. "Because if my father's sacrifice secured this pack's survival, and if that debt was meant to be honored across generations, then I would think the manner in which you treat his daughter matters a great deal to the honor of this council." Oliver leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Marcus. "Is this true, Alpha? Is there truth to what she says?" Marcus hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena saw confirmation enough for the entire chamber to draw its own conclusions. "My father spoke of an old debt," Marcus admitted finally, reluctantly. "He never gave me the full details before he passed. I believed my marriage to Elena was a matter of alliance, yes, but also of genuine affection. I did not fully understand the depth of what her father's sacrifice may have meant for our survival." "Convenient," Oliver muttered, "that such details were never shared with the rest of us either." The chamber erupted into quiet but urgent conversation, elders debating amongst themselves, some clearly troubled by the implications of what Elena had revealed, others looking to Henry for confirmation of the old history. Henry, for his part, rose slowly to his feet, silencing the room with his presence alone. "I can confirm what Elena has said," Henry announced. "Aldrich Voss brokered peace between Ashwood and the Northern Territories at great personal cost, decades before most of you were old enough to remember the danger this pack once faced. That debt was real, and it was significant. I believe it deserves far more consideration than it has received in recent decisions." Marcus's expression had shifted from discomfort to something closer to alarm. Elena watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes darted toward Brielle, toward the council, toward the door, as though searching for some escape from a conversation spiraling further from his control with every passing moment. "This changes nothing about my intentions regarding Brielle," Marcus said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "The alliance with her family remains strategically important." "Perhaps," Oliver said, "but strategic importance does not erase obligation. And obligation, Alpha, is something this council takes very seriously." Elena said nothing further. She had accomplished what she came to do. Not to argue, not to beg, but simply to plant a seed of truth in a room full of people who had, until now, only known half the story of her life. She turned and left the chamber before the debate could continue, her heart pounding, her mind already racing ahead to what might come next. Outside, the evening air felt sharp and clean against her skin. She had not expected to feel this way, not triumphant, not entirely, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt, for the first time in 21 years, like standing on solid ground of her own making, rather than ground built entirely around someone else's decisions. Sophie found her near the tree line, her expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Mom, what you did in there." "I told the truth," Elena said simply. "You've never talked about grandfather like that before. I didn't even know most of what you said." Elena studied her daughter's face, seeing in it echoes of her own younger self, uncertain and searching for footing in a world that had just shifted beneath her. "There is a great deal about my past I chose to leave behind when I married your father," she admitted. "I am beginning to understand that may have been a mistake." Daniel joined them moments later, his expression fierce with something like pride. "The whole pack is talking about it already. Oliver practically tore into Dad in there after you left. Henry backed up everything you said." Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Good. Let them talk. Perhaps it is time this pack remembered a few truths it has conveniently forgotten." That night, as she sat once more with her father's journal, Elena found herself reading with new purpose, searching now not simply for grief or nostalgia, but for specifics. The exact terms of the treaty, the exact nature of the debt, anything that might clarify precisely what obligations Ashwood still owed to the Voss bloodline, and what recourse she might have if those obligations continued to be ignored. She found, tucked into the back pages of the journal, a folded document she had somehow overlooked in her earlier reading. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing her father's precise handwriting detailing the specific terms of the agreement, terms that included not only peace between territories, but explicit promises of protection and respect toward any descendant of the Voss bloodline who might, in the future, become connected to Ashwood through marriage or alliance. "Any dishonor shown to my descendants," the document read, "shall be considered a dishonor to the treaty itself, and grounds for its reconsideration." Elena read the line 3 times, her heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. If this document was legitimate, and if the council took it seriously, then Marcus's treatment of her was not simply a personal betrayal. It was, potentially, a violation of an agreement that had protected Ashwood for decades. She closed the journal carefully, her mind already turning toward what she might do with this knowledge, how she might present it, and what consequences it could set into motion for a pack that had underestimated her for far too long. Outside her window, the moon had begun its slow descent, and somewhere across the territory, she imagined Marcus lying awake as well, perhaps beginning to understand that the woman he had so casually set aside was not as powerless as he had assumed. By morning, the entire territory seemed to know what had happened in the council chamber. Elena could feel it in the way pack members watched her as she walked toward the training grounds, their expressions no longer filled with pity but with something closer to curiosity, even respect. Word traveled fast among wolves, and the story of Aldrich Voss's daughter standing before the council and reminding them of an old, unpaid debt had clearly captured the pack's imagination. But not everyone was pleased. Elena found Marcus waiting for her near the old training grounds, his expression tight with barely restrained frustration. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "About what exactly?" Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. "About what you did yesterday, bringing up your father's treaty in front of the entire council, without warning me first." "Without warning you," Elena repeated, "as you warned me before announcing your intention to take a second mate?" Marcus's jaw tightened. That was different. Was it? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Elena remembered from countless late nights over the years, whenever he was frustrated by a problem he could not immediately solve. "The council is questioning whether my judgment can be trusted. Oliver has been quietly gathering support among the older families, suggesting that dishonoring your father's legacy could nullify the very protections that treaty provides us. And is that untrue?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, and for a moment, Elena saw genuine uncertainty flicker across his face. "My father never explained the full terms to me before he died. I always assumed the debt had been settled long ago, through our marriage." "Perhaps it was," Elena said. "Until you decided a settled debt could simply be renegotiated on your own terms, without consulting anyone whose bloodline was actually part of the original agreement." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "What do you want, Elena? Do you want me to end things with Brielle?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had expected. Elena studied her mate carefully, searching for some trace of the man she had married 21 years ago, the man who used to rest his head in her lap after difficult negotiations, who used to tell her she was the only steady thing in his life. "I want you to understand," Elena said slowly, "that whatever this marriage once was, it can no longer continue on the terms you have chosen. You cannot humiliate me in front of the pack, move me from our shared quarters into a small cabin at the territory's edge, and then ask me to simply accept whatever crumbs of respect you decide to offer in return." "So what are you proposing?" "I am not proposing anything yet," Elena said. "I am simply telling you the truth, and I suggest you spend some time considering what that truth means for your position as Alpha. before the council decides it for you." She left him standing there, his expression a complicated mixture of frustration and uncertainty, and walked toward the small cabin she now called home, aware that their conversation had shifted something fundamental between them, though she could not yet say precisely what. That afternoon, Oliver sought her out, finding her near the eastern well where she had gone to fetch water, a task she no longer needed to perform herself, but found oddly grounding after the tension of recent days. "Elena," he said, falling into step beside her. "I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than through rumor and gossip." "I appreciate that," she said. "The council is divided," Oliver admitted. "Some believe Marcus acted within his rights as Alpha, regardless of any old debt. Others, myself included, believe that dishonoring the daughter of Aldrich Voss is a far more serious matter than Marcus seems willing to acknowledge. And what do you believe should happen?" Oliver considered the question carefully. "I believe the council should formally review the terms of the original treaty and determine whether Marcus's actions constitute a violation serious enough to warrant consequences. I also believe," he added, his tone softening slightly, "that you deserve far better than what you have received these past few weeks, regardless of what the council ultimately decides." Elena thanked him, grateful for his honesty, and continued on her way, her mind turning over the possibilities his words had opened. A formal review of the treaty, consequences for Marcus's actions. She had not fully considered what such a review might mean, not just for her own standing, but for the entire structure of power within Ashwood. That evening, Margaret visited again, this time accompanied by a woman Elena did not immediately recognize. An older wolf with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the cabin's modest furnishings. "Elena," Margaret said, "this is Charlotte. She serves on the Council of the Eastern Territories, the same territories Brielle's family controls." Elena studied Charlotte carefully, uncertain why a member of Brielle's own political sphere would seek her out. "I'm surprised to see you here," she admitted. Charlotte offered a small, knowing smile. "I imagine you are. I came because word of your father's treaty has reached my territory as well, and because my own family's history with the Voss bloodline is more complicated than most in Ashwood realize." "What do you mean?" "My grandmother served alongside your father during the negotiations that ended the northern conflict," Charlotte explained. "She spoke of him often, of his fairness, of his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for the sake of lasting peace. When I learned that his daughter was being treated so poorly by the very pack his sacrifice protected, I felt compelled to intervene." "Intervene how?" "Brielle is my niece," Charlotte said, and Elena felt a jolt of surprise at the revelation. Her mother, my sister, arranged this alliance with Marcus without fully considering the political complications it might create. "I have spoken with my sister, and with Brielle herself. Neither of them wishes to be at the center of a conflict that dishonors the very treaty that has kept our territories safe for decades." Elena studied Charlotte carefully, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Are you suggesting your family might withdraw support for the alliance?" "I am suggesting," Charlotte said carefully, "that my family has no interest in provoking the wrath of a bloodline as significant as yours, Elena, regardless of whatever personal arrangement Marcus believes he has secured. We will not stand against the Voss name, not when our own safety has depended on it for so long." The weight of Charlotte's words settled over Elena slowly, revealing a political landscape far more complex than she had initially understood. Marcus's alliance with Brielle's family was not as secure as he believed, and if Charlotte's family withdrew their support, the entire foundation of his decision could crumble. "Thank you for telling me this," Elena said finally. "I did not expect such honesty, especially from someone connected to Brielle." "Brielle is young," Charlotte said, not unkindly. "She was drawn into this arrangement by ambition, and by promises Marcus made that she did not fully understand the cost of. I do not believe she wishes to be the reason an old and important treaty is broken." After Charlotte left, Elena sat alone with Margaret for a long while, processing the implications of everything she had learned. "This changes things," Margaret said quietly. "It does," Elena agreed. "If Brielle's own family withdraws support, Marcus's entire justification for this alliance collapses." "What will you do?" Elena considered the question carefully, staring into the fire, as the flames danced and flickered before her. For the first time since the gathering that had upended her life, she felt something like clarity settling over her, a sense of the path ahead beginning to take shape. "I think," she said slowly, "it is time I stopped simply reacting to what Marcus decides, and started deciding some things for myself." Margaret smiled, though there was concern in her eyes as well. "And what might that look like?" I am not entirely certain yet, Elena admitted, but I know it will not involve quietly accepting whatever arrangement Marcus believes is acceptable. 21 years, Margaret. 21 years I gave this pack, and this man, without ever once considering what I might build for myself, if I chose to. That night, long after Margaret had gone home, Elena returned once more to her father's journal, searching now for any mention of her own future, any guidance her father might have left behind for a daughter he perhaps suspected might one day need to reclaim a legacy she had left behind. She found, near the final pages, a passage that stopped her breath entirely. Should my daughter ever find herself without the protection she deserves, he had written, let it be known that the territories east of the old river remain hers by right of blood, held in trust until she chooses to claim them, or until her line ends entirely. Elena read the passage again and again, her mind racing with possibilities she had not previously considered. Territories, held in trust, by right of blood. She was not simply the daughter of a man who had brokered an old peace treaty. She was, potentially, the rightful heir to territories entirely separate from Ashwood, territories that had been waiting, patiently, for over 2 decades, for her to remember they existed. For the first time since the gathering that had shattered her world, Elena Voss allowed herself to imagine a future that did not depend entirely on Marcus Cole's decisions, or on the pack's willingness to honor an old debt. She imagined, instead, a future built entirely on her own terms, rooted in a legacy she had almost let slip away. The fire burned low as she finally closed the journal and set it aside, her mind already turning toward the Eastern Territories, toward the possibilities waiting there, and toward the question of whether she was ready to claim a birthright she had spent 21 years trying to forget. Word of Charlotte's visit spread through the pack within days, and with it came a subtle but unmistakable shift in the balance of power that had defined Ashwood since the night of the gathering. Elena noticed it first in the way pack members greeted her, no longer with cautious pity, but with a wary respect reserved for someone whose next move could not easily be predicted. Marcus summoned her to the Alpha's quarters on the 5th day after Charlotte's visit, his expression drawn and tired in a way Elena had rarely seen during their 21 years together. She had not set foot in these quarters since the night of the announcement, and walking through the familiar door felt strange, like visiting a home that had once belonged to her but no longer did. You spoke with Charlotte, Marcus said without preamble. She spoke with me, Elena corrected. I did not seek her out. She is threatening to withdraw her family's support for the alliance with Brielle. Is she? I imagine that must be difficult for you. Marcus studied her for a long moment, something like exhaustion settling into the lines of his face. You've changed, Elena, since the gathering. I'm not certain I recognize the woman standing in front of me. Perhaps, Elena said, you never fully knew the woman standing in front of you, even before the gathering. Perhaps I simply allowed you to see only the parts of myself that made your life easier. He flinched slightly at that, and Elena felt a small, complicated satisfaction at having finally struck a nerve that mattered. That's not fair, he said. I loved you. I still do not, Elena said sharply. Finish that sentence unless you are prepared to explain why loving me apparently did not prevent you from humiliating me in front of the entire pack. Marcus fell silent, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of 2 decades pressing down on the space between them. Finally, he sighed, sinking into the chair behind his desk, looking older and more uncertain than Elena had ever seen him. The council is planning a formal review, he admitted. Oliver has gathered enough support to force the issue. They intend to examine the original treaty in detail, and determine whether my actions constitute a violation serious enough to affect Ashwood's standing. And what do you believe they will conclude? I don't know, Marcus admitted. I never fully understood the terms my father agreed to. I assumed our marriage settled whatever debt existed. I did not realize there might be additional obligations tied to your father's legacy specifically. Elena considered him carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated authority he usually wore so effortlessly. She found instead something closer to genuine uncertainty, a man confronting the possibility that decisions he had made without full information might now cost him far more than he had anticipated. There is something else you should know, Marcus continued, his voice quieter now. My father left records as well, similar to whatever your father may have left you. I did not think much of them until recently, when the council began asking questions I could not answer. What do they say? Marcus reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew an old, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. He hesitated before sliding it across the desk toward her. I think you should read this yourself. Elena opened the ledger carefully, scanning the pages filled with Marcus's father's handwriting, documenting decisions and agreements made decades ago during the aftermath of the Northern conflict. Her breath caught as she found a passage referencing Aldrich Voss directly. The debt to Aldrich Voss remains unsettled beyond the marriage arrangement, the entry read. Full repayment requires recognition of his daughter's independent claim to the Eastern Territories, a claim I have chosen, for political convenience, not to formally acknowledge during my lifetime. Elena read the passage 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. Your father knew, she said slowly. He knew about the Eastern Territories, and chose to hide that knowledge rather than honor the full terms of the treaty. It appears so, Marcus admitted, his voice heavy with something like shame. I did not know any of this until I began searching through his old records after the council announced their intention to review the treaty. I did not want to believe my father would have deliberately withheld something so significant. Yet here it is, Elena said, gesturing at the ledger. Written in his own hand. Marcus rubbed his temples, looking suddenly much older than his years. Elena, if this becomes public, if the council learns that my father deliberately hid your rightful claim to territory, it will not simply affect my standing with Brielle's alliance. It could affect the Pact's entire relationship with the Eastern Territories, with Charlotte's family, with dozens of other alliances built on the assumption that our treaty with your father's bloodline was fully honored. And yet you are showing this to me anyway, Elena observed. Why? Marcus met her eyes, and for a moment, Elena saw something raw and uncertain flicker across his expression. Because I owe you the truth, Elena. Whatever else has happened between us, whatever mistakes I have made, I do not wish to compound them by hiding information that is rightfully yours to know. Elena studied him for a long moment, uncertain what to make of this sudden honesty after weeks of humiliation and silence. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was simple political calculation, an attempt to soften her toward him before the council's review concluded. Or perhaps, buried beneath 21 years of complicated history, some genuine remnant of respect still remained between them. What do you intend to do, she asked finally, now that you know the truth? I don't know, Marcus admitted. I know the council will likely demand some form of formal acknowledgement of your claim to the Eastern Territories. I know Brielle's family may withdraw their support entirely once they understand the full political complications. And I know, he added, his voice quieter now, that whatever happens next, I have not treated you as you deserved, and I am not certain any explanation I offer will be sufficient to repair that. Elena closed the ledger carefully, holding it against her chest as she rose from her seat. You are right about one thing, she said. No explanation will be sufficient, but I appreciate that you chose honesty, even now, even when it may cost you everything you were hoping to gain from this alliance. She left the Alpha's quarters with the ledger clutched tightly in her hands, her mind racing with the implications of everything she had just learned. Not only did she have a legitimate claim to territories east of the old river, but that claim had been deliberately hidden by Marcus's own father, a betrayal that stretched back decades, long before Marcus himself had ever become Alpha. She found Henry near the training grounds, his expression shifting to concern as he noticed the ledger in her hands. Elena, what is that? She explained quickly, watching as Henry's face paled with each revelation. This is significant, he said finally. If the council learns that the previous Alpha deliberately withheld acknowledgement of your claim, it will raise serious questions not just about Marcus's judgment, but about the entire foundation of trust between Ashwood and the territories that depend on honoring old treaties. What do you recommend? Elena asked. Henry considered the question carefully. I recommend bringing this ledger before the council directly, during their formal review. Let them see the full truth, rather than allowing Marcus to control the narrative any further. You have spent 21 years allowing others to shape the story of your life, Elena. Perhaps it is time you told that story yourself, in your own words, before the very council that will decide what happens next. Elena nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settling over her, heavy but strangely clarifying. She thought of her father's journal, of the territories waiting patiently for her claim, of the 21 years she had spent quietly serving a pack that had, in the end, underestimated her at every turn. Then that is what I will do, she said finally. I will bring this ledger before the council, and I will tell them everything. About my father's treaty, about the territories owed to me, and about the years of silence that allowed this debt to remain unpaid. Henry offered a small, approving nod. The council convenes again in 3 days. That should give you time to prepare. 3 days. Elena walked home beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the ledger held carefully against her chest, her mind already turning toward what she would say, how she would present the truth. and what consequences might follow once the entire pack finally understood the full scope of what had been hidden from them for so long. For 21 years, she had built her life around supporting someone else's ambitions. Now, for the first time, she found herself preparing to stand before the pack not as anyone's Luna, but as the daughter of Aldrich Voss, ready to claim what had always, rightfully, been hers. The 3 days before the council's formal review passed slowly, each hour thick with anticipation that seemed to settle over the entire territory like a fog that refused to lift. Elena spent much of that time in quiet preparation, reading through her father's journal again and again, cross-referencing details with the ledger Marcus had given her, building a clear and undeniable account of the truth she intended to present. Sophie helped where she could, sitting beside her mother late into the evenings, reading through old passages and helping organize the scattered fragments of history into something coherent. "I never knew any of this," Sophie admitted one night, studying a passage detailing the northern conflict her grandfather had helped resolve. "Why did you never tell us about him?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I think, in some ways, I was trying to protect myself from the weight of his legacy. Your grandfather was a great leader, Sophie. I was not certain I could ever live up to what he built, so I chose instead to build something smaller, quieter, for myself here in Ashwood." "But you were building something important here too," Sophie said. "You kept this pack together for 21 years. "Perhaps," Elena said. "But I wonder now if I could have done so much more, if I had not spent so long trying to be smaller than I truly was." Daniel, for his part, had grown increasingly protective in the days since the gathering, often standing guard near the cabin as though anticipating some retaliation from Marcus or his allies. Elena appreciated his loyalty, though she gently reminded him that whatever conflict lay ahead would be resolved through words and truth, not through confrontation or violence. On the second night before the review, Brielle herself came to visit, arriving alone and unannounced, her expression uncertain as she stood at the edge of Elena's small cabin. "I did not expect to see you here," Elena said, studying the young woman carefully. "I did not expect to come," Brielle admitted. "But I could not stop thinking about everything that has happened since the gathering, and I felt I owed you an honest conversation, rather than allowing rumors to speak for me." Elena gestured for her to sit, and after a moment of hesitation, Brielle did, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "My Aunt Charlotte has told me about your father's legacy," Brielle said. "I did not know, when Marcus first approached my family about this alliance, that any of this history existed. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that I was simply being offered an opportunity to strengthen my own family's standing." "And now?" Elena asked. "Now I am not certain what I believed anymore," Brielle admitted. "I do not wish to be the reason an old and important treaty is broken. I do not wish to build my own future on the foundation of someone else's humiliation." Elena studied the young woman carefully, searching for any trace of manipulation or calculation, and finding instead only genuine uncertainty, the confusion of someone who had been drawn into a situation far more complicated than she had initially understood. "You were young," Elena said finally, "and ambitious, and Marcus offered you an opportunity that must have seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. I do not blame you for accepting it, Brielle. My anger has never truly been directed at you." "Then at Marcus," Brielle said quietly. "At Marcus, and at the years of silence that allowed my father's legacy to be hidden away, unacknowledged, while this pack benefited from the peace he sacrificed so much to secure." Brielle nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "My family intends to withdraw formal support for the alliance before the council's review," she said. "I wanted you to hear that from me directly, rather than through rumor." Elena felt something loosen slightly in her chest at the revelation, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Thank you for telling me," she said, "and for your honesty, tonight and throughout this difficult situation." Brielle rose to leave, then paused at the doorway, turning back toward Elena, with an expression that seemed suddenly older than her 24 years. "For what it is worth," she said, "I do not think Marcus ever intended to cause you this much pain. I believe he simply did not think through the consequences of his decisions as carefully as he should have." "Perhaps," Elena said, "but intentions do not undo consequences, Brielle. I hope, whatever path you choose going forward, you remember that lesson." After Brielle left, Elena sat alone for a long while, processing the unexpected conversation. She had not anticipated feeling any sympathy toward the young woman who had, however unwittingly, played a role in her humiliation. Yet here she was, recognizing in Brielle's uncertainty echoes of her own younger self, drawn into circumstances larger than she had initially understood. The following morning, Elena received an unexpected visit from Margaret, who arrived carrying troubling news. The council has been receiving pressure from unexpected quarters, Margaret explained. Several of the older families, ones who remember your father's sacrifice most clearly, have begun demanding not just acknowledgement of your claim to the Eastern Territories, but formal consequences for Marcus's handling of the entire situation. What kind of consequences? Elena asked. Some are suggesting a formal censure, Margaret said. Others are suggesting something more severe, a review of his fitness to continue leading Ashwood at all, given how poorly he has handled a matter of such historical significance. Elena absorbed this information carefully, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and unease. She had not set out to destroy Marcus's leadership, only to reclaim her own dignity and the legacy her father had left behind. Yet the political consequences of the truth she had uncovered seemed to be spiraling beyond what she had originally intended. I did not seek this outcome, she said quietly. Perhaps not, Margaret said, but truth has a way of setting its own consequences into motion, regardless of what any of us originally intended. You cannot control how the council chooses to respond to what you reveal tomorrow, Elena. You can only control the honesty and integrity with which you present it. Elena nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Margaret's words even as uncertainty continued to churn in her stomach. That evening, she reviewed her preparations one final time, reading through her father's journal, the ledger Marcus had provided, and the notes she and Sophie had compiled together, ensuring every detail was accurate, every claim well supported by the evidence she now possessed. As she finally set the documents aside for the night, she found herself thinking not of Marcus or of the council's potential decisions, but of her father, a man she had spent over 2 decades trying to forget, whose legacy had somehow found its way back to her at precisely the moment she needed it most. She wondered what he would think, watching her prepare to stand before Ashwood's council, ready to claim a birthright she had once fled from entirely. She hoped, somewhere beyond the reach of memory, he might feel some measure of pride in the daughter who had finally found her way back to the strength he had always tried to instill in her, even in the brief years they had shared together before circumstances pulled her toward an entirely different life. The night before the review, sleep came slowly, fragmented by dreams of her father's voice, steady and calm, reminding her of lessons she had almost forgotten. She woke before dawn, the sky outside still dark, and sat quietly by her window, watching the first hints of morning light begin to spread across the territory that had been her home for 21 years, and that was about to witness a transformation none of its members could have fully anticipated. Today she would stand before the council not as Marcus Cole's Luna, humiliated and set aside, but as the daughter of Aldrich Voss, ready to reclaim a legacy that had waited patiently, for over 2 decades, for her to remember it existed. The council chamber was filled to capacity by the time Elena arrived, every seat occupied, wolves standing along the walls in numbers she had never before witnessed at a formal review. Word of the impending revelations had clearly spread throughout the territory, drawing not only Ashwood's own pack members, but representatives from neighboring territories as well, all eager to witness whatever truth was about to unfold. Marcus sat at the head of the long stone table, his expression carefully composed, though Elena noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained clasped tightly together as though bracing for what was to come. Brielle sat beside him, though her posture had shifted noticeably since the last council meeting, no longer confident and poised, but visibly uncertain, glancing occasionally toward the door as though anticipating her aunt's arrival. Oliver called the review to order, his voice carrying easily across the crowded chamber. We are gathered today to formally examine the treaty between Ashwood and the bloodline of Aldrich Voss, and to determine whether recent actions taken by our Alpha constitute a violation of its terms. Elena stepped forward, the ledger and journal clutched carefully in her hands, aware of every eye in the chamber turning toward her. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in the quiet hours of the previous night, yet standing here now, facing the full weight of the council's attention, she felt the enormity of what she was about to reveal settling over her like a physical weight. Thank you for allowing me to speak, she began, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. 21 years ago, I came to this pack as a young woman, choosing to leave behind my birth pack and the legacy of my father, Aldrich Voss, in order to build a life here with Marcus Cole. I believed, at the time, that this choice was born entirely of love. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber before continuing. Recently, I have learned that this belief may have been incomplete. My father brokered a peace treaty decades ago that saved this very pack from destruction at the hands of the Northern Territories. That treaty included a promise that Ashwood would honor any request made by the Voss bloodline, and that any descendant of my father would be treated with the respect and protection owed to those who ensured this pack's survival. She opened her father's journal to the passage she had memorized, reading it aloud for the entire council to hear. The chamber fell utterly silent as her father's words, decades old, filled the space with a weight that seemed to transcend time itself. I did not fully understand the significance of this treaty until recent weeks, Elena continued, when circumstances forced me to revisit records I had left buried for over 2 decades. What I discovered was troubling. Not only had my marriage to Marcus likely been shaped by this old debt, rather than purely by choice, but crucial details of the treaty's terms had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge. She held up the ledger Marcus had given her, and she saw him flinch slightly at the sight of it, aware of what was coming. This ledger belonged to Marcus's father, the previous Alpha of Ashwood. In it, he explicitly acknowledges that the debt owed to my father was never fully settled through marriage alone, but required formal recognition of my independent claim to territories east of the old river. He chose, for reasons of political convenience, never to honor this acknowledgement during his lifetime. A wave of murmurs swept through the chamber, elders exchanging shocked glances, younger pack members whispering urgently among themselves. Henry rose slowly from his seat, his expression grave. "I can confirm the authenticity of that ledger," he said. "I recognize the previous Alpha's handwriting, and I recall vaguely, in my younger years, hints of unresolved matters connected to the Voss Treaty that were never fully explained to the rest of the council." Oliver's expression had darkened considerably as he absorbed the implications of Elena's revelation. "So not only has our current Alpha humiliated the daughter of the very man who saved this pack from destruction," he said slowly, "but this dishonor extends back through generations, hidden deliberately by his father before him." "That is a serious accusation," Marcus interjected, finally finding his voice. "My father is not here to defend his choices, nor is my father here to defend the terms of a treaty he negotiated at great personal cost," Elena replied evenly, yet his words remain, recorded clearly, for anyone to read. The chamber fell silent once more as Elena continued, laying out the full scope of what she had discovered. The Eastern Territories held in trust for her by right of blood. The deliberate silence maintained across 2 generations of Ashwood leadership, and the manner in which her own humiliation at the recent gathering had brought these old, unresolved debts back into the light. When she finished speaking, she closed the journal and ledger, holding them against her chest, and waited as the council absorbed the full weight of everything she had revealed. Charlotte rose from among the visiting representatives, her expression solemn. "My family has closely followed these proceedings," she announced, "and I wish to formally state, on behalf of the Eastern Territories, that we withdraw our support for any alliance between Marcus Cole and my niece Brielle, until such time as the Voss Treaty's terms are fully and properly honored." Brielle, seated beside Marcus, lowered her eyes, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering discomfort at being caught so publicly at the center of this unfolding conflict. Oliver turned to address Marcus directly. "Alpha Cole, how do you respond to these revelations?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority. "I did not know the full extent of what my father had hidden," he admitted. "When I discovered the ledger, I chose to share it with Elena directly, rather than concealing it further, though I understand that choice does little to undo the harm already caused." "It is something," Henry said quietly, "but it does not erase the fact that this pack has, across 2 generations, failed to honor a debt owed to the very bloodline responsible for its survival." The council fell into urgent, heated discussion, elders debating the appropriate response to such a significant revelation. Some argued for immediate formal acknowledgement of Elena's claim to the Eastern Territories. Others suggested a broader review of Marcus's fitness to continue leading Ashwood, given the severity of the deception uncovered. Elena stood quietly amid the debate, watching as the pack she had served for 21 years grappled with the truth she had finally chosen to bring into the light. She felt no triumph in the chaos unfolding around her, only a quiet, steady sense of vindication, the sense that after decades of silence, both her own and her father's legacy, the truth had finally found its voice. Oliver eventually called the chamber back to order, raising his hand for silence. "Given the severity of these revelations," he announced, "the council will require additional time to determine the appropriate response. We will reconvene in 1 week's time to render a formal decision regarding both the Voss Treaty's terms and Alpha Cole's continued fitness to lead this pack." The chamber began to empty slowly, wolves filing out in hushed, urgent conversation. the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over the entire territory like a heavy fog. Elena remained standing near the council table, watching as Marcus approached her, his expression unreadable. "I did not expect this outcome," he admitted quietly, once most of the chamber had cleared. "Neither did I, entirely," Elena said. "But perhaps that is precisely why it needed to happen. Truth has a way of finding its path forward, regardless of how carefully we try to bury it." Marcus studied her for a long moment, something like regret flickering across his features. "Whatever the council decides, Elena, I hope you know that I never intended for things to unfold this way." "Intentions matter less than consequences," Elena replied, echoing the words Margaret had offered her days earlier. "And the consequences of this particular truth, Marcus, are only just beginning to unfold." She left the chamber without waiting for his response, walking out into the cool evening air, aware that the pack she had known for 21 years was about to change in ways none of them could yet fully predict. Behind her she could hear the murmur of the dispersing crowd, voices rising and falling with speculation about what the council's eventual decision might mean, not just for her own future, but for the entire structure of leadership that had governed Ashwood for generations. For the first time since the gathering that had shattered her world, Elena felt something like control returning to her life, the sense that whatever came next, she would face it not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman finally reclaiming the strength and legacy that had always been rightfully hers. The week following the council's initial review passed in a strange, suspended tension, the entire territory holding its breath as it waited for the formal decision that would determine not only Elena's future, but potentially Marcus's continued leadership as well. Elena spent much of that week fielding visits from pack members she had rarely spoken with before, wolves who had suddenly rediscovered a deep respect for the legacy of Aldrich Voss, and who seemed eager to align themselves with whatever direction the political winds were shifting. She found this newfound attention exhausting in its own way, though she recognized it as an inevitable consequence of the truth she had brought to light. Margaret helped her navigate the sudden influx of visitors, gently redirecting those who seemed motivated purely by political calculation, while encouraging genuine conversations with those who approached with sincerity. Oliver visited on the third day of that tense week, his expression grave. "The council remains divided," he admitted. "Some believe formal acknowledgement of your territorial claim is sufficient to resolve the matter. Others believe Marcus's judgment has been so thoroughly compromised that he can no longer effectively lead this pack." "What do you believe?" Elena asked. Oliver considered the question carefully. "I believe Marcus made a serious error in judgment, both in his treatment of you and in his failure to fully understand the historical obligations his own father left unresolved. Whether that error is severe enough to warrant removal from leadership, I am not entirely certain. That is, ultimately, a decision for the full council to make." "And Brielle's family?" Elena asked. "Have they made any further statements?" "Charlotte has formally withdrawn all support for the alliance," Oliver confirmed. "Brielle herself has requested to return to her family's territory, stating that she no longer wishes to be part of an arrangement built on such significant historical dishonor." Elena absorbed this news with a complicated mixture of relief and something almost like sympathy for the young woman who had, in the end, found herself caught in a conflict far larger than she had ever anticipated. "I hope she finds peace, wherever her path leads next," Elena said quietly. That evening, Daniel returned home with news of his own, having spent much of the week observing the shifting political currents among the younger pack members. "There's a growing faction," he said, "of wolves who believe you should be offered formal leadership over the Eastern Territories, separate entirely from Ashwood's governance. Some are even suggesting you should be recognized as an alpha in your own right, rather than simply reclaiming your father's old lands as a distant holding." Elena considered this news carefully, feeling something shift inside her at the possibility Daniel had just described. She had spent the past weeks focused primarily on reclaiming acknowledgement of her father's legacy, on ensuring the debt owed to her bloodline was finally honored. She had not fully allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to step into leadership entirely of her own, separate from Ashwood, separate from Marcus, separate from the identity she had built around being someone else's Luna for over 2 decades. "That is a significant possibility," she said slowly. "One I had not fully considered until now." "Would you want that?" Sophie asked, watching her mother carefully. "To lead your own territory, separate from here?" Elena did not answer immediately, allowing herself to sit with the question, to feel out the shape of a future she had not previously dared to imagine. "I do not know yet," she admitted finally, "but I find myself, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely curious about what such a future might look like." The following days brought increasing clarity regarding the council's likely decision, as word filtered back through various channels that the majority of elders had come to favor a resolution involving Elena's formal recognition as an independent alpha over the Eastern Territories, while allowing Marcus to retain his position as Ashwood's leader, though with significant conditions attached regarding future transparency and honoring of old treaties. Marcus himself sought her out once more during this period, finding her near the training grounds where she had gone to watch Daniel spar, a habit that had become something of a comfort during these turbulent weeks. I understand the council is leaning toward recognizing your independent claim to the Eastern Territories, he said. So I have heard, Elena replied. I want you to know, Marcus continued, that whatever the council ultimately decides, I do not intend to stand in the way of your claim. You deserve this recognition, Elena, regardless of the personal complications it creates between us. Elena studied him carefully, noting the genuine sincerity in his expression, however complicated her feelings toward him remained. Thank you for saying that, she said, though I imagine the council's decision regarding your own leadership may prove more complicated to navigate. Perhaps, Marcus admitted, I have made mistakes, Elena, significant ones. I am not certain what the future holds for my leadership, or for whatever remains between us, but I am trying, at least, to face the consequences honestly, rather than continuing to hide behind convenient justifications. That is something, Elena said, echoing Henry's earlier assessment, though I imagine it will take considerably more than good intentions to fully repair the damage of these past weeks. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the truth of her words without argument. For what it is worth, he added quietly, I am proud of the strength you have shown throughout this entire ordeal. I do not think I fully understood, until recently, the depth of what you were always capable of. Elena did not respond immediately, uncertain how to process this unexpected acknowledgement after so many weeks of humiliation and betrayal. Finally, she offered a small, measured nod. Perhaps, she said, we both have a great deal to learn about who we truly are, now that the illusions we built our marriage around have finally fallen away. They parted ways without further conversation, and Elena returned home that evening, feeling the weight of an approaching decision that would reshape not just her own future, but the entire political landscape of the territory she had called home for over 2 decades. 3 days later, the council formally reconvened, and this time, Elena entered the chamber not as a woman seeking acknowledgement of past wrongs, but as someone prepared to embrace whatever new chapter awaited her, regardless of the council's specific decision. Oliver rose to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the weight of the momentous announcement he was about to deliver. After careful deliberation, he began, this council has reached a formal decision regarding the matters brought before us. The chamber fell silent, every wolf present holding their breath as they awaited the verdict that would determine the future of Ashwood, of the Eastern Territories, and of the woman who had, in the span of a few short weeks, transformed from a quietly devoted Luna into a figure whose legacy could no longer be ignored or diminished. Elena stood tall at the center of the chamber, her father's journal held close against her chest, ready to face whatever came next with the same quiet strength that had carried her through 21 years of service, and that had, in these recent turbulent weeks, finally found its true and rightful voice. This council, Oliver continued, his voice steady and clear across the crowded chamber, formally recognizes Elena Voss as the rightful heir to the Eastern Territories, held in trust by her father, Aldrich Voss, until such time as his descendant chose to claim them. This recognition is granted immediately, and without condition, in acknowledgement of the significant debt this pack has owed to the Voss bloodline for decades. A wave of murmurs swept through the chamber, though this time the tone carried something closer to approval than the shocked uncertainty of the previous review. Elena felt the weight of the announcement settle over her, equal parts vindication and the beginning of a responsibility she had not fully anticipated carrying. Furthermore, Oliver continued, given the significant governance required to properly establish and lead these territories, this council formally recognizes Elena Voss as an independent alpha, separate from Ashwood's leadership structure, with full authority over the eastern lands and the wolves who choose to align themselves with her governance. The chamber erupted into a mixture of applause and urgent whispered conversation, the significance of this decision rippling outward through the crowd. Elena stood motionless at the center of it all, absorbing the full weight of what had just been granted to her, not simply acknowledgement of an old debt, but genuine, independent authority, a chance to build something entirely her own after 21 years of building someone else's legacy instead. Oliver raised his hand once more, quieting the chamber before continuing. Regarding Alpha Cole's continued leadership of Ashwood, he said, his tone growing more serious. This council has determined that while his handling of recent events demonstrated significant lapses in judgment, his willingness to ultimately act with transparency, including his choice to reveal his father's hidden ledger, demonstrates sufficient capacity for growth and accountability. He will retain his position as Alpha, though under formal council oversight regarding any future decisions involving historical treaties or significant political alliances. Marcus, seated at the head of the table, absorbed this decision with visible relief, though Elena noted the complicated mixture of emotions still evident in his expression. Relief at retaining his leadership, tempered by the clear understanding that his authority had been significantly diminished by the council's new oversight requirements. "This concludes the formal review," Oliver announced. "Elena Voss, if you are prepared to accept this recognition, we ask that you step forward and formally claim your position as Alpha of the Eastern Territories." Elena felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her once more, and this time, rather than feeling the weight of judgment or pity, she felt something entirely different, the quiet, steady anticipation of a new beginning finally within reach. She stepped forward, her father's journal still held close against her chest, and faced the assembled council with the same calm composure that had carried her through 21 years of service to a pack that had, in the end, come to recognize the strength she had always possessed. "I accept this recognition," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber, "and I intend to honor my father's legacy by leading these territories with the same fairness and dedication he demonstrated throughout his own leadership. I do not take this responsibility lightly, and I am grateful to this council for finally acknowledging a debt that has gone unpaid for far too long." The chamber erupted into applause, wolves rising from their seats to honor the moment, and Elena felt, for the first time in weeks, something like genuine joy breaking through the exhaustion and tension that had defined her recent days. Sophie and Daniel stood near the front of the crowd, their expressions filled with pride, and Margaret caught her eye from across the chamber, offering a warm, knowing smile. As the chamber began to empty following the announcement, Henry approached her, his weathered face creased with genuine warmth. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. "I knew him only briefly, in my younger years, but I remember clearly the strength and fairness he carried into every decision. I see much of that same strength in you, Elena." "Thank you, Henry," she said, "for everything you have done to help bring this truth to light." Charlotte approached as well, extending a formal offer of alliance between the Eastern Territories she represented and Elena's newly recognized leadership. "I look forward to working alongside you," Charlotte said. "Your father's legacy deserves nothing less than a strong and capable successor, and I believe you will prove more than equal to that responsibility." Brielle lingered near the edges of the dispersing crowd, and when Elena caught her eye, the young woman offered a small, genuine smile, before turning to leave the chamber, presumably to begin the journey back toward her family's territory, free now from an alliance that had never truly served her own interests. Marcus approached last, once most of the chamber had cleared, his expression a complicated mixture of respect and lingering uncertainty about what their future relationship might look like, given the significant changes that had just reshaped both their lives. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Truly, Elena, whatever complications remain between us, you have earned this recognition many times over." "Thank you," Elena said, studying him carefully. "I imagine our paths will continue to cross, given the proximity of our territories and the alliance our histories seem determined to maintain." "I imagine so," Marcus agreed. "I hope, in time, we might find a way to interact as something other than adversaries, even if what we once shared as mates has clearly reached its end." Elena considered his words carefully, feeling the truth of them settle into her chest. Whatever love had once existed between them, 21 years of shared history could not simply be erased by recent betrayals, even if the marriage itself could no longer continue as it once had. "Perhaps," she said finally, "time will tell what remains possible between us, Marcus. For now, I intend to focus on building something new, something entirely my own." She left the council chamber that evening surrounded by her children, by Margaret, by the growing circle of allies who had helped her navigate these turbulent weeks, walking out into an evening sky that seemed, for the first time in a long while, to promise possibility rather than uncertainty. The following morning, Elena began the process of formally establishing her new leadership over the Eastern Territories, meeting with representatives from various families who had pledged their support, reviewing the boundaries and resources of the lands her father had left in trust for her, and slowly, carefully, beginning to imagine what kind of leader she intended to become. She thought often, during those early days, of her father, of the journal that had guided her through the darkest weeks of her recent betrayal, and of the strength he had always tried to instill in her, even during the brief years they had shared together, before circumstances pulled her toward an entirely different life. She hoped, wherever his spirit now rested, that he recognized the daughter who had finally found her way back to the legacy he had left behind. As the days passed and her new leadership began to take shape, Elena found herself waking each morning with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years, perhaps decades. She was no longer simply Marcus Cole's Luna, defined entirely by her devotion to someone else's ambitions. She was Elena Voss, Alpha of the Eastern Territories, finally stepping into the legacy that had always, rightfully, been hers to claim. A year passed swiftly once the Eastern Territories began to flourish under Elena's steady leadership, transforming from lands that had sat quietly held in trust for over 2 decades into a thriving community of wolves who had chosen, one by one, to align themselves with the daughter of Aldrich Voss. Elena had built her new life carefully, deliberately, drawing on lessons learned across 21 years of service to Ashwood, while shaping a leadership style entirely her own. She established her main hall near the old river her father had once mentioned in his journal, a location that felt symbolically significant, marking both the boundary of her territory and the connection between her father's original sacrifice and the new legacy she was building in his name. Sophie had chosen to remain by her side, taking on increasing responsibility within the territory's governance, while Daniel split his time between assisting his mother and maintaining ties with Ashwood, where he continued training among the warriors he had grown up alongside. Margaret had relocated as well, unable to imagine remaining behind while Elena built something so significant without her closest friend beside her. Henry visited often, offering wisdom drawn from his decades of experience, gradually becoming something of an informal advisor to Elena's growing council. Oliver maintained strong ties between the Eastern Territories and Ashwood, ensuring the alliance between the two lands remained steady and mutually respectful. Charlotte's family had become one of Elena's strongest allies, their shared history and mutual respect for Aldrich Voss's legacy forming the foundation of a partnership that benefited both territories significantly. Brielle, Elena had learned through occasional correspondence, had returned to her family's lands and had recently begun courting a young wolf from a neighboring pack, someone she had chosen entirely on her own terms, without the complications of old debts or political obligations shaping her decision. Marcus remained Alpha of Ashwood, though the council's oversight had fundamentally changed the nature of his leadership, requiring greater transparency and consultation before any significant decisions could be made. Elena and Marcus crossed paths occasionally during formal gatherings between their two territories, their interactions carrying the careful, measured respect of two people who had once shared everything, but who now understood the boundaries that separated their current lives. He had not taken another mate in the year since the council's decision, though Elena had heard rumors that he remained cautious now, aware of how thoroughly his previous choices had reshaped not just his marriage, but the entire structure of his leadership. She did not know whether he had learned the lessons this experience seemed designed to teach him, though she found, with some surprise, that she no longer carried the same anger toward him that had once defined her darkest days. On the anniversary of the council's formal decision, Elena stood at the edge of the old river, watching the water flow steadily past the boundary of her territory, and found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the past year. She had arrived at this point in her life through devastating betrayal, through humiliation she had never anticipated experiencing after 21 years of loyal service. Yet somehow, through the darkness of that experience, she had rediscovered a strength and legacy that had been waiting patiently for her to reclaim it. Sophie joined her at the riverbank, watching the water alongside her mother in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophie asked finally. "Everything that happened? If Dad had never chosen Brielle, you would never have discovered any of this." Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret the pain it caused, certainly," she said. "I regret 21 years spent believing my worth was defined entirely by my usefulness to someone else's ambitions. But I do not regret who I have become because of it. I do not regret finally remembering that I was always capable of building something entirely my own." "Grandfather would be proud," Sophie said quietly. "I believe he would," Elena agreed, thinking of the journal she still kept close, its pages worn now from constant reading and rereading during the transformative months of the past year. "Though I think, more than pride, he would simply be relieved that I finally found my way back to the strength he always believed I possessed." As the sun began to set over the Eastern Territories, casting long shadows across the water that marked the boundary between her past and her present, Elena felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, The kind of peace that comes not from avoiding hardship, but from surviving it, from transforming devastating betrayal into the foundation of something new and entirely her own. She thought of the young woman she had once been, 23 years old and hopeful, leaning against an old oak tree while Marcus proposed marriage beneath a moon that had witnessed countless promises since. She thought of the woman she had become in the years that followed, devoted and quiet, building a life around someone else's leadership, while slowly forgetting the strength of her own bloodline. And she thought, finally, of the woman standing now at the edge of this river, an alpha in her own right, leading a territory that had waited over 2 decades for her to claim it, surrounded by children who had watched her transform pain into purpose, by friends who had stood beside her through every difficult decision, and by a legacy that had finally found its rightful place in the world. 21 years she had given to a marriage that ultimately could not sustain the weight of genuine partnership, but in the year since that marriage had effectively ended, she had built something far more lasting, a legacy rooted not in devotion to someone else's ambitions, but in the quiet, steady strength her father had always tried to instill in her, finally allowed to flourish after decades spent dormant beneath layers of sacrifice and self-diminishment. As darkness settled fully over the territory, Elena turned from the river and walked back toward her hall, her daughter beside her, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, secure now in the knowledge that whatever came next, she would face it not as anyone's forgotten Luna, but as Elena Voss, alpha of the Eastern Territories, finally standing fully in the legacy that had always, rightfully, belonged to her. The story of her betrayal had once seemed like an ending, the collapse of everything she had spent 21 years building. But standing here now, watching the last light fade over territories that thrived under her leadership, surrounded by the family and legacy she had reclaimed, Elena understood that it had never truly been an ending at all. It had been, from the very beginning, the start of everything she was always meant to become.